What's up guys, welcome back. My name is Warren. I am a banker here in London and a property investor across the UK. My goal is to live free on my own terms from property. So my goal is to get to £3,000 per month in property income in the next 5 years. If that's what you would like to do, if you want to live free through property, subscribe. That's what we're all about. That's what my content is all about. So guys, today's video is about how most people like you, like me, can become millionaires from UK property, from investing consistently. I'm going to go through why it's so important right now and how you can do this simply and effectively. So let's start with some context here in the UK and globally, but specifically here in the UK. Let's talk about real wages, which is the level of growth in wages minus the impacts of inflation, which is a natural rise in prices, including wages over time. So wage growth has been about as inactive as Man United signings this season over the past 10 years. And why am I saying this? Because the average inflation since 2012, so for the last 10 years, has been 1.8% annually. I know it's doing a madness right now, we're at around about 9%, but over the longer term, the last 10 years, it's averaged out at 1.8% per year. Now, in parallel to that, the average wage growth has been 3.1%, but we're talking about real wage growth. So you have to take away the average inflation rate from the wage growth of 3.1%. So we're left with 1.3%. That's a growth in real wages per year since 2012, 1.3%. We as workers are not getting richer in the UK. And the reason why that's mad, guys, is because when you consider how prosperous the global economy has been over the past 10 years. Yes, we've had a pandemic, we've left the EU, etc., but when we're talking about corporations like Tesla, your Amazons, your Apples, your Googles, with the advent of the internet and the global integration of the economy, these companies have gotten richer and richer and richer, and you would expect workers like you and me, ordinary citizens like you and me, and I'm laughing because we all know what the truth is. We have not become, our personal wealth, our personal richness and prosperity hasn't grown in parallel with how corporations have grown over the last 10 years plus, guys. And that's why it's so important to invest in the stock market as well. But that's another video for another day. But it gets worse. Let's talk about being middle class, right? Most of us in jobs, in professions, would count ourselves as middle class. I grew up working class. I grew up on a council estate in London, in South London. But right now, I went through the education system, got my degree. But guys, middle class today is not what middle class was in our grandparents or even our parents' generation. Now let's look, right, at a definition of what it means to be middle class. So middle class is a description given to individuals and households who typically fall between working class and upper class. In Western cultures like ours, persons in middle class tend to have a higher proportion of college degrees. So translate college degree for university degree, that's American lingo. And we have more income, i.e. we're richer, available for consumption, and may own property. Now that's a funny one, may own property, but I'll come back to that. And those in the middle class are often employed as professionals, managers, civil servants. So there's four main aspects to being middle class according to this definition, and there's a lot of definitions out there. But first is education. So you've basically gone into higher education if you're middle class, for the most part. Not everybody has, but for the most part. You have a certain type of employment, you're in a certain demographic when it comes to jobs, you're professionals, you're managing, your civil servants, as opposed to say lower skilled tertiary jobs. So education, your type of job, and you may own property. And lastly, you have a higher amount of disposable income. Now I'm going to pick some holes in this, guys, because most of us, when we hear the words the middle class, we associate it with some degree of prosperity, some degree of financial freedom and ownership of assets. Now, I, myself being middle class, and many of my friends being middle class, do not feel that way. I don't know if you do at home, and let me know in the comment section below. But many of my friends in the middle class who are professionals, who have gone into higher education or do have some sort of degree, absolutely do not have large amounts of disposable income at the end of each month, especially living in London, right? Your income is going primarily on rent, or your mortgage. Right now, a lot of it's going towards utilities, gas, electric bills, travel expenses. It's really expensive to travel here in London. And if you have a child, childcare is ridiculous, guys. You know, I've got friends with children and they tell me how much they spend on nursery per month. I mean, what are they doing in these nurseries? Are they serving the kids caviar or something? Because when I hear the price of nursery, it really does blow my mind. But back to the point, guys. Being middle class, so if you compare middle class today to, say, our grandparents' generation, I was with my parents-in-law the weekend before last, and my mother-in-law was telling me about her father. Her father worked in a printing press, which was a good job, a decent job back during that time. He, on just his salary alone, was able to raise 3 kids and a stay-at-home wife, all on his salary, and he was also able to buy and own the house that they lived in. Now today, in a middle-class professional job, one person is not able, for the most part, unless you're like a CEO, right, at a large corporation. And bear in mind, her father was not a CEO, he was a worker, he was a member of staff, fairly senior. But as a senior member of staff in an independent organization, most people are not able to buy and own a house, raise 3 kids, and have a stay-at-home wife on one salary. Middle class today is not what it was back then. It has deteriorated over time, guys. We are less well off. By the way, guys, if you're enjoying this video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. It really helps with the algorithm and the growth of this channel. Now back to the video. And if we look at this article from the Times, we can see that since the 1970s, as I said earlier, in the UK, despite the rising prosperity of the country, the top 40% have had a more rapid rise in their living standards than the bottom 60%. And I know it's a cliche, but the super rich, those at the very top, have only gotten richer. And it's been a continuing trend since the 1970s. If you look at the last 3 years during the C word, not that one, but the global health pandemic, we have seen one of the biggest transfers in wealth in the past decades, right? And that's come as a result of quantitative easing. A lot of that money that was printed went right to the top echelons of society globally. Don't know about you, but the government printed around about 250 billion pounds worth of money during the global health pandemic, and it barely touched the size for the likes of me and my friends and people in my class. But somehow the richest people in society, your CEOs, your Elon Musks, your Jeff Bezoses, the billionaires of the world got even richer during that time. The biggest wealth transfer in the last few decades. Look into it more, guys. It's very interesting stuff. And then further on in this article, it talks about some of the reasons behind, or the causes behind, how and why the rich have gotten richer over the last 50 years, and the middle class have effectively slipped down the scale and gotten less well off. So first of all is a wage squeeze. So at the beginning of this video, I focused on the last 10 years and showed you that growth in wages, real wages, has been pretty minimal over the last 10 years. This is zooming out even further. It's talking about how much of the national wealth, so I guess they're talking about GDP/GNP, how much of that has actually been funneled into wages since the 1970s. So 65% since 1973 compared to 53% today. So an increasingly smaller proportion of the nation's wealth has gone towards wages since the 1970s. And then secondly, the increase in concentration of the earnings pool at the top. So the richest members of society have gotten richer. I mean, when you look at the wage growth of, say, CEOs for the last 50 years, the rate of increase in what a CEO gets paid really has ballooned. I mean, not to put the business of the companies I've worked for out there, but you know, in the banking sector, it really is not uncommon for CEOs to get paid 20, 30 million per year when you factor in bonuses, shares, you know, their full compensation package basically. And then thirdly, it talks about a decline in the employment opportunities of people in middle and lower earnings classes. So tell me what you think about this one. The article, rising population growth in general, so not enough jobs to go around. I sound like Nigel Farage here, but let me know what you think about this one. But a few reasons that they put forward for what we're talking about. And I found this graphic. It's basically a paper on how the wages of middle class in Britain is shrinking. So if you studied economics, you would know one of the basics, core tenets of economics is that production, increasing more goods and services is the source of long-term growth. If you want your economy to grow sustainably and consistently over the long time, you have to produce more. And what I want to draw your attention to is you can see the kind of bronzy colored bar. That is productivity growth in the UK economy. And the turquoise bar is the wage growth in the economy. And from 1980s to 2000s, you can basically see that the gap between productivity and wage growth has gotten greater. If you start in the 1980s, wage growth was actually greater than productivity growth. And then as we've gone towards 2000s, the growth of productivity has come down slightly, but the growth in wages has more than halved over that time. So what are we seeing here? We're basically seeing that businesses have been, fairly consistent with their productivity from the 1980s to the 2000s. There's a slight decrease there, but they are paying out less in wages. So they're basically keeping more money for themselves. Where does that money go? It goes to shareholders and executives. So the richest people when it comes to corporate structure and ownership are getting richer, whilst the actual workers are getting squeezed out. Interesting stuff. So in summary, guys, most people are not going to become rich from a wage alone. We're being paid less, we have less disposable income, and it's only going to get worse. So this is more about survival and making sure that we're okay and that we can play the system to our advantage. So how do we do that, guys? How do we ensure that we're okay? How do we build wealth? How do we become rich? How can we make it to millionaire status if that's your goal? One answer to that, guys, is to invest in assets, namely UK property, UK housing. It's a unique asset, guys, because first of all, and I'm going to give you some reasons why. First of all, we live in one of the most desirable countries in the world to live in. London is one of the primary economic hubs of the world. It's one of the most desirable places to live in Europe and the world for that. It's up there with America, parts of America, Hong Kong, and other places like that. Now, when it comes to property, the unique thing about the UK is that it is a highly populated country over a small landmass. And the way that that translates to UK property is that there has been, and still is, a long-term undersupply of UK housing and over demand. So not only do people want to come here in large numbers to the UK, but in broad terms, there isn't enough housing. So that makes for an asset that you can invest in that's going to be in high demand. You want to invest in an asset that's in high demand and under supply. Why? Because the price does that over time. It'd be completely different if this was, say, Albania. No disrespect to Albania, but people don't want to move to Albania like they do to London, to the UK. I wouldn't invest in property in Albania because there's not going to be a demand for it like there is here. And because of that over demand and under supply, property in the UK grows consistently over the long term. Over the last 10 years, it's grown at an average rate of 6.8% per year. You'll be hard pressed to find any other asset with a long-term growth of 6.8% per year, guys. And when you check the Office for National Statistics stats on the sources of wealth in the UK, property is the second largest source of wealth for individuals in the UK. It makes sense to invest in it because of the nature of property, because of those factors that I just talked about, the supply demand factor, and also London, UK being such a desirable place in the world to live. And that translates to its growth over time. And let's also talk about leverage, guys. This is an aspect of property that often gets glossed over, right, when it comes to investing. There's, again, few other assets that allow you to put down 25% of the cost of it, have the rest lent to you and benefit from that growth over time, as long as you're choosing a property in a good location. Leverage allows you to enhance your returns, guys. Leverage is essentially using a mortgage instead of paying the full price of a house in cash. Most people can't do that, and that's a big reason why institutions, banks provide mortgages to help the ordinary person to buy these properties. But as an investor, if you're buying to invest, it also helps you to amplify your returns. The hardest part, guys, is saving for your first property. I've done other videos on this, but I would recommend buying in cheaper areas, partnering up with other people. Those are two great ways to be able to afford property, especially in areas of the UK where it's more expensive. Typically down south in the southeast and London. Up north tends to be a lot cheaper when it comes to affording property. But guys, that is a summary of why it's really important to invest in assets mainly property, in order to first of all survive what's happening in this country as it relates to wages and being middle class and just affording to live. But also in parallel to that, it's actually going to build your wealth over time, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Give me a follow, give me a subscribe, guys. Really helps with the algorithm. Follow me on TikTok, I'm now on there, and I'll see you guys soon.